Hi guys, Chris Parkin here, just doing a quick video on shadows and lighting. I've already done a couple on this, but it's obviously a concept that people tend to struggle with and something that is really critical when you're looking at doing photo composites. So I just see if I can give you some more hints and ideas as to how to deal with them and how to look for your shadows and make sure that you're actually starting off with the shadows that look right in the first place. So I'm just going to use a few images from Flickr, and obviously you'll be able to see copyright information. They're all Creative Commons at some point, and you'll have the web addresses up here, so you'll be able to actually see what's what and have a look. So there's a couple of ways of looking at shadows. One is to simply draw a line between your shadow, and it particularly works well with points, point of an object and the same point within the shadow, and draw a line back, and that means your light source is going to be somewhere up here. The other thing that can be quite useful to look at is eyes, and catch lights in the eyes. That's this little white piece here, and that tells you that the light is mainly from up here. Obviously we can see that it's outside and of a bird, so the chances are very high it's sunlight. And we can look at the way that the shadow actually interacts with its environment. You end up with, in this case, a fairly yellowy shadow. I suspect that the filter's been added to the photo later, as most of the time in daylight you will end up with the shadow having a blue color cast to it because you've got blue sky filling up the rest of the ambient light. So yeah, keep an eye on that. A couple of other things to note: you've got the edge of your shadow here is much harder because it's been cast by the object that's closer to the ground. Further away you get, the more diffuse the edge of a shadow is, and that's why when your cloud passes between us and the sun, if you're watching the ground, the light will change gradually rather than being an abrupt change. And that's all to do with how the sun interacts with the edge of the shadow, and the fact that it's a long way away. It also changes depending on how big your light source is. So if you've got a nice softbox that you're using in a studio, you'll end up with a much more diffuse light. In terms of real life and everyday environment, when that cloud goes in front of the sun, it's going to diffuse the light more as well, so you end up with a much more diffuse shadow. When you're doing Photoshop work, it's generally easier to work with a sunny day and a strong shadow to make the objects fit. If you don't put the shadows in, then they seem to be floating, and that can cause you some grief with objects not looking right. So obviously in terms of shadows, from a Photoshop point of view, strong light's useful. From an aesthetic point of view, strong light like this one, midday light, is not fantastic because you end up with very hard shadows, and the light can be relatively unflattering. Having said that, so what you want to do is probably aim for something that you're looking at late evening light, so you've still got the shadows, but they're being cast longitudinally, and you've got the angle of light to play with. But let's have a look at this shadow and how it behaves. So we've got I think it's Maria Sharapova's leg, and you can see that her foot would be somewhere in here. So sunlight is heading up a long way up this way. But as her leg gets close to the ground, you've got a join here, and if that wasn't happening, we'd be thinking that she was floating in some way or form. So yeah, be careful of that one, that you join up the shadow on the feet. You also end up with some translucency within the material here, because her shirt or dress is semi-translucent, and the same with the strings, so you don't end up with a solid shadow, it's a partial shadow, and that can be fun to try and Photoshop with noticing. Okay, couple walking along here and just looking at how the shadows fall along the ground, which is fairly typical of how we do the shadows, but then you note the shadows as they hit the wall, because the wall's in the same plane as the people, you then end up with the shadow going vertical. And that's something to be very aware of, that when you're casting shadows and they hit objects, they need to bend over those objects, and how they interact with it depends on the object that they hit. Generally much easier to deal with when you're dealing with a flat object than one that's curved, and the curved objects can be quite good fun. And again, this one, trying to show you some of the bumps and the curves in the sand. You've got the bumps here, so the hand, although the hand would be a relatively smooth curve, you've still got some undulation in here. And this is interesting because it ties into one of the myths around why we didn't land on the moon, because people were going, oh, the shadows go in different directions. Must have used multiple light sources. It's quite simple. The land isn't flat on the moon, and therefore the shadows bend in different directions relative to the camera. But useful to know, really hard to replicate, and generally easier if you ignore the finer details in the land. Your human eye might just work out what's going on, but generally it's not too much of an issue. Okay, and lastly, again, we've got, how do we know this dog's leg is off the ground and not touching its other paw? It's because of its shadow. So we couldn't just use the silhouette of the dog and transpose it onto the ground. You actually need to capture, one option is to capture the dog or the object that you're using from the same direction that the sun's coming, and grab that outline, and then you keep the leg off the ground, and that distance between these two shadows shows us that the paw is up. So hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas in terms of what to look for. The biggest thing is to make sure that your shadows and lights all match. When you're putting your composite images together, you don't have to take them all at the same time. You don't have to use manual light balance. However, if you do, and you also use manual exposure and keep your exposure settings the same, then it does make life a lot easier when it comes to putting the images together. If you are downloading things from Flickr, make sure that the copyright allows you to reuse them. In this case it's Creative Commons, attribution is fine, and you're allowed to adapt. Make sure that it says you can adapt, and if you happen to be using it for 207, it's going to be a commercial image, so you need to make sure that you can use it commercially. However, check with your tutor, because particularly for 207, it's supposed to be your own work, not borrowing somebody else's. So yeah, lights, shadows, the hue and the colour of the shadow I've covered as to how you can change them, but if you can capture it at the time that you take multiple photos for a composite, it does make life easier. Doesn't show your skill level as much, but it does make it shows your skill level with the preparation rather than the Photoshop execution, but the two do tie in together, so you're good there. Okay, yeah, that's enough for me rabbiting on, but hopefully it gives you a few ideas. Cheers.